Okay, so get ready because we're about to take a deep dive into this book. And it's a book that really asks this kind of unsettling question. You know,
Mm.
what does it mean to feel like you're disqualified from being human? We're going to be looking at No Longer Human by Osamu Dazai.
Mm.
And it's a Japanese novel that's kind of, I don't know, it's both a classic and a bit of a punch in the gut, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it follows the life of Oba Yozo.
Yeah.
But it doesn't do it in like a typical biography way.
Right.
It's not like, here's his birth and here's this and here's that. We're experiencing his story through like his own personal notebooks. And so it's really raw and intimate. And it takes us straight into the mind of someone who's struggling with some dark stuff.
Yeah, exactly. You get that right away. And
Right
it's
thing.
not just a story. It's like you're holding his thoughts and feelings right in your hands.
Yeah.
And you get this sense right from the beginning that he's deeply alienated, even as a child.
Wow.
He talks about not understanding basic human behaviors, like why people need to eat large meals, even though he goes through the motions to please others, you know?
So there's this feeling of like always performing, putting on a mask for the world.
Yes, exactly. And he adopts this persona of a clown, using humor to deflect from his true feelings. He's terrified of revealing his authentic self, so he hides behind this laughter and these jokes.
And there's actually an incident early on in the book that I think really highlights this, where Yozo purposely falls down at school to make everyone laugh. And then this quiet boy, Takechi, he whispers to him that he knows it was intentional. And Yozo's completely thrown off by this, because he always saw Takechi as unintelligent. Yet this boy can see right through his facade. It's really fascinating what happens next.
Yeah. It's this pivotal moment that really shakes his sense of control. And it makes him terrified of being exposed, so he decides to befriend Takechi, almost as a way to keep an eye on him, to kind of ensure that his secret stays safe.
It's interesting. It feels like kind of a turning point where this need for control starts to manifest in a darker way.
Yeah.
And then as he gets older, this feeling of alienation, it just deepens.
Right.
And he starts to express himself through art. But it's disturbing art. It's grotesque even. And he sees it as a reflection of his true self, like this darkness that he hides from the world.
Yeah, and this fascination with disturbing art, it's not just a phase, it's a recurring theme throughout the novel. And it speaks to this internal struggle that he has, this constant battle between the mask he presents to the world and this inner turmoil that's raging within him.
So we've got this young man, deeply uncomfortable in his own skin, always performing, drawn to dark and unsettling art. And then he heads off to Tokyo for college. So what happens next in his life?
Well, in Tokyo, he's still financially dependent on his father, who's a politician, and they have a strained relationship. He's living on a small allowance, which fuels a sense of anxiety about the future. And it's in this environment that he meets Horiki, who's a classmate. And Horiki introduces him to this world of drinking and smoking and fleeting relationships.
So it's like, here comes the classic downward spiral
Yeah.
that we see in so many stories about struggling artists.
Yes, but what's fascinating is, even as he falls into this pattern of self-destruction, he still maintains this ability to perform, to kind of adapt to different social settings.
Yeah.
So, for example, he joins the Communist Party, not out of any genuine belief in their ideology, but because he's good at fitting in and gaining a sense of belonging, even if it's superficial.
It's like he's constantly searching for connection, but he's never allowing himself to be truly vulnerable. So he's always putting on this show, even within a political movement. And then his life takes a pretty dramatic turn when his father sells the townhouse that he's living in.
Oh, yeah. This event is crucial because it marks a significant shift in his financial stability, because up to this point, he's been relying on his father's money.
Right.
But now he's suddenly plunged into poverty. And this just intensifies his feelings of helplessness, and it deepens his reliance on alcohol as a coping mechanism.
So he's already struggling with this deep sense of alienation, this need to perform for the world, and this reliance on alcohol. And then he meets Tsuneko, who is a bartender who seems to kind of see through his facade.
Yeah, Tsuneko's a really interesting character because she offers him a glimpse of genuine connection. She understands his despair on a deeper level than anyone else he's encountered.
But their relationship takes a dark turn, doesn't it?
It does. It culminates in a suicide pact. Tsuneko proposes that they die together.
Wow.
And Yozo, consumed by his own hopelessness, agrees. They attempt suicide by drowning. Tsuneko tragically dies, and Yozo survives. But he's now haunted by the weight of this experience.
Talk about a turning point.
Yeah.
He's lost the one person who seemed to truly understand him. And now he's facing the legal and social consequences of this tragedy. So what happens in the aftermath?
Well, he is arrested as an accomplice to suicide, and he's expelled from university. I mean, he's lost everything. His support system, his education, his sense of purpose. He's completely broken.
So he's hit rock bottom. What's next for him? Where does he go from here?
He's released into the care of Flatfish, who's an old family friend, and Flatfish is urging him to come up with a plan for the future. But Yozo, lost in his despair, can't articulate any desires or aspirations. He's utterly lost.
And it seems like this pressure from Flatfish, however well-intentioned, it just seems to make things worse for him, right?
It does, and he eventually declares that he wants to be a painter. But it feels more like a desperate attempt to appease Flatfish than a genuine ambition.
Yeah.
He's still searching for external validation, for someone to tell him who he should be, rather than finding that answer within himself.
So he's stuck in this cycle
Yeah.
of seeking approval and direction from others,
Yeah,
but never truly connecting with his own desires.
exactly. And it's this pattern that leads him to flee Flatfish's home and seek refuge with Shizuko, a woman he met through Horiki.
Right.
He's once again seeking escape and comfort in a relationship. But it's clear that he's still deeply wounded and unable to form healthy connections.
So we've got Yozo at this point. He's been through so much trauma and loss. He's battling addiction. He's constantly searching for something to fill this void within him. What happens next?
He finds like this temporary respite with Shizuko from all of his troubles. She offers him this sense of normalcy and stability, which he desperately craves. He even returns to illustrating to help make ends meet. But sadly, it just becomes another way to fuel his addictions.
It's heartbreaking. You see him kind of repeatedly fall back into these destructive patterns.
Yeah.
He gets so close to finding some peace, but then it slips away.
Exactly. And this pattern continues when an arranged marriage with Shizuko is proposed.
Oh, wow.
You'd think this might offer him some stability, but Yozo ultimately decides to leave. He can't bear the thought of separating Shizuko's daughter, Shikeko, from her biological father.
It's actually a surprisingly selfless act from him. It suggests that he's capable of empathy, even in his state of despair.
It's a glimmer of hope, right? A
Right.
sign that maybe he hasn't completely lost himself. But sadly, this moment of clarity is fleeting. He ends up isolating himself once again, seeking solace in a bar in Kyobashi. And it's there he encounters Yoshiko, a young woman who will play a significant role in the next chapter of his story.
From what you've said, it sounds like his relationships with women are always complicated. It's like this mix of seeking comfort and causing pain. What is it about Yoshiko that draws him in?
Well, he's immediately captivated by her innocence. He sees in her a purity that he feels he lacks, and in a drunken haze, he impulsively proposes marriage, driven by this desperate longing for something pure and good.
It feels like another attempt to find salvation through external means. To fix his inner turmoil by attaching himself to someone he perceives as untainted.
Precisely. And surprisingly, Yoshiko agrees to marry him.
Really?
But she has one condition. He must give up drinking. It's as if she intuitively understands his destructive tendencies and believes that sobriety is the key to his redemption.
A classic case of hope battling addiction. Do you think Yozo truly believed he could change for her?
It's hard to say. He makes the promise. But his past actions suggest he's not one for keeping his word. And sure enough, he breaks his promise almost immediately, falling back into his old habits.
It's tragic because Yoshiko is so trusting, right?
Yeah.
She chooses to believe in him despite his relapse. They get married, and for a brief time, things seem almost normal. But this fragile peace is shattered when Horiki reappears, bringing with him the familiar temptations of alcohol and self-destruction.
Yeah, Horiki's return marks a significant turning point, not just for Yozo's sobriety, but for the well-being of Yoshiko as well. One night, while drinking on Yozo's rooftop, Horiki witnesses a horrific act. A man raping Yoshiko.
That's just awful. How does Yozo react to this?
Instead of intervening, he passively observes, frozen by a mix of fear and emotional detachment. It's one of the most disturbing moments in the book. It reveals the extent to which Yozo has lost his capacity for empathy and action.
It's hard to imagine witnessing such a horrific act and not doing anything. It suggests a level of dissociation, a disconnect from reality.
Yeah.
That's truly chilling.
Exactly. And when Yoshiko later tells him about the rape, she actually tries to downplay the event, saying that the man assured her nothing would happen. This further highlights Yozo's emotional paralysis. He's unable to confront the gravity of the situation, retreating further into himself.
So he doesn't comfort her. He doesn't get angry. He just shuts down.
Yes. He drowns his guilt and shame in alcohol, pushing Yoshiko further away and deepening his isolation. He attempts suicide again, this time with sleeping pills. But even death seems to reject him. He wakes up 3 days later, still trapped in his nightmare.
What a devastating moment. Even in his darkest hour, he can't find release. So what happens next?
Well, Flatfish, still trying to help, sends him to recover at a hot springs resort. But Yozo spends the entire time drinking, completely sabotaging any chance for healing. His physical health deteriorates. He starts coughing up blood, his body ravaged by years of alcohol abuse.
It sounds like he's reached a point of no return, both physically and emotionally.
Desperately seeking relief from his physical pain, he visits a pharmacy where he encounters an elderly pharmacist. He feels this instant connection with her, sensing a shared understanding of the world's pain and sadness.
It's interesting how, even in his broken state, he still seeks out human connection, even if it's rooted in despair.
It speaks to a deep longing within him, a desire for understanding that he's never been able to fulfill. And the pharmacist, recognizing his suffering, advises him to stop drinking, but then offers him morphine as an alternative.
Oh, wow. So it's like trading one form of escape for another, even more dangerous one?
Precisely. Yozo becomes addicted to morphine, sinking deeper into this self-destructive spiral. He even begins an affair with the pharmacist, further highlighting his inability to form healthy relationships and his tendency to exploit others for his own needs.
So he's now addicted to morphine, entangled in a toxic relationship, and physically deteriorating. It feels like he's reached the absolute bottom.
This downward spiral culminates in his final suicide attempt. He's driven to such despair that he sees no other way out. But this attempt is also thwarted, leading to his committal to a psychiatric ward.
Imagine the irony. He feels disqualified from being human and is then placed in an institution for those deemed mentally unfit.
It's a cruel reflection of society's inability to understand and address mental illness. Yozo is labeled, ostracized, ultimately abandoned by the world he so desperately wanted to connect with.
It's a tragic end to a life filled with so much pain and unfulfilled potential. Where does the story go from here?
He's released from the ward, but not into freedom. One of his brothers arranges for him to live in the countryside under the care of like an older maid.
Yeah.
And it's a far cry from the life he knew in Tokyo, almost like being erased from the society that rejected him.
Yeah, it really does feel very symbolic, sending him away to this kind of quiet corner of the world. So does he find any peace there, or is it just another form of isolation?
Well, in these final chapters, we get these glimpses into his reflections through his notebook entries, right? And he writes about his lost youth, his wasted potential, and his profound inability to connect with others.
It's heartbreaking.
It is, because he's only 27. Yet he describes himself as looking much older, worn down by years of hardship and self-destruction.
Yeah, hearing that just makes you realize the heavy toll his life has taken. It's not just physical deterioration, it's like this loss of hope, this sense that his life has slipped away without him ever truly living it.
And as the novel concludes, it's not Yozo's voice that closes the story. Remember, we've been experiencing everything through his notebooks.
Right.
But the narrative shifts to the perspective of the unnamed speaker, the one who received Yozo's notebooks from the bartender in Kyobashi.
Oh, wow. So it's like we're stepping back from Yozo's intensely personal account.
Yeah.
And we're seeing him through someone else's eyes. What's the impact of this shift in perspective?
Well, it adds another layer of complexity. I mean, it forces us to question whether Yozo's account is entirely reliable, whether his perception of events is colored by his mental state. It also raises questions about the unnamed speaker's motives. Why share these intensely personal writings with the world? What's the message they're trying to convey?
Yeah, I can see how that would leave the reader with a lot to think about. It's not just Yozo's story anymore. It becomes about how we interpret and understand the stories of others, particularly those who are different or marginalized.
That's the brilliance of No Longer Human. It leaves us with more questions than answers, prompting us to grapple with these complex themes of identity, belonging, and what it means to be human in a society that often pushes people to the margins.
So for our listeners, what are some of the key takeaways from this deep dive into No Longer Human? What should we be thinking about long after we finish the book?
I think it's a powerful reminder that we often mistake outward appearances for someone's true self, just like Yozo did with Takechi early in the story. It challenges us to look beyond surface judgments and recognize the complex struggles that people might be hiding beneath their masks.
Yeah, it also highlights the dangers of societal pressures and expectations, right? I mean, Yozo constantly felt this need to perform, to conform to what he thought others expected of him. And that ultimately led to his downfall. So it raises questions about authenticity, the pressure to fit in, even if it means sacrificing our true selves.
And finally, it's a plea for empathy and understanding. Yozo's story is a tragic reminder of the consequences of isolation and alienation. It urges us to be more compassionate, more willing to listen to those who are struggling, and to create a world where everyone feels seen, heard, and valued for who they truly are.
That's a powerful message to carry with us. This deep dive has definitely given me a lot to reflect on.
And hopefully, it will inspire our listeners to pick up a copy of No Longer Human and engage with these themes for themselves. I mean, it's a challenging read, but it's a powerful and important one. It'll stay with you long after you finish the last page.
That's all the time we have for today's deep dive. We hope you found this exploration of No Longer Human insightful and thought-provoking. Join us next time for another deep dive into a world of ideas.